Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about science and science fiction. But we tend to find that in science fiction, there tends to be a lot of exploratory truth involved. After all, we're stretching ideas that although seem improbable at this particular moment in time, somebody along the way is figuring out a way to make things work. On the program today, we're going to be joined with Dr. William R. Fortune, who holds a Ph.D. in history from Purdue University. He specializes in military history and the history of technology. His biggest study has been the history of space exploration, and he also holds an interest in what he defines as mega engineering projects. We're going to find out more about that and also talk with him about his best-selling book, Pillar to the Sky. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program our guest, Dr. William Fortune. Dr. Fortune, how are you today?
It's a pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, now, this is an interesting book because what is being talked about in here, and of course it is a story, and I like the way that's put because it kind of stretches people to go, okay, well, maybe this isn't so improbable. You ever notice when you write a nonfiction, they demand that it be accurate? But in here, we're kind of exploring some things that are really on the fringe. Tell our listeners about that.
My novel is about the building of a space elevator. There are, I think I could accurately say there are only really two ways for us to ever get into space. And we're using the first technology right now. We can call it first-generation space technology, which is rockets. Mathematical theories on that have been worked out a long time ago. You have to accelerate an object for low Earth orbit up to over 17,000 miles an hour. The rockets, most people, I hope, do realize the rocket doesn't go straight up. It goes out as an angle to finally enter into Earth's orbit. There is a second way, and to actually leave Earth completely and head to the moon, what they call translunar injection or trajectory, you have to get up to 25,000 miles an hour. There is a second way, which would cost about 1/1,000th the cost right now, which can run as high as $2,000 to $3,000 a pound to get into orbit. And that is to build an elevator. I know sounds kind of wacky, the thought of it. That's one heck of a long elevator ride. But it's been theorized for over 100 years. First worked out by a Russian scientist, Tsiolkovsky, back around 1905, that if you go up to geosynchronous orbit, 23,000 miles up, you string a cable made of some of the new materials that we're developing now, C60 or perhaps a new graphene, working graphene technology. You string this cable from geosync, you bring it down, and you anchor it at the Earth's equator. Centrifugal force imparted to that cable by the rotation of the Earth will keep the cable rigid. Then all you need to do is hook an elevator car on it, and you're on the way to the stars. Just ride that long elevator ride out to space at the geosynchronous orbit, and what you're doing is you're taking the energy of the Earth's rotation, imparting it to the object going up the cable, and you've now achieved orbital velocity.
Mm-hmm.
Picture it this way. Snap the whip when you were a kid, or just take a long piece of rope, tie a little rock to the end of it, spin it around your head, and when that rock releases, does it come straight back at you, or does it go off into another direction? So that's sort of a quick way of trying to explain what's a heck of a lot of math.
Yeah, it's interesting, too, because you talk about how rather than boosting a rocket from the surface of planet Earth, which takes millions of pounds of fuel just to, get into or just above the Earth's orbit or whatever the case may be, but then, you need that extra thrust before you can actually get there out into space, where this does more of a slingshot effect that gets you up there and then slings you off of it, sort of like a slingshot, if you will, and then, you can pretty much go anywhere.
You just gave me the term. Thank you. Because with all the interviews I've ever done, I never thought of using the analogy of the slingshot effect.
The coyote effect, Wile E. Coyote, the slingshot effect.
But this is not an Acme product. Okay.
No, it's really fascinating when you think about, for instance, and you talk about this in the book, in the story Pillar to the Sky, is, they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we start building this thing? And you think about how you build towers here on Earth, and the taller the tower, the wider the base needs to be, and maybe even deeper into the ground. But this is something, this space elevator, this pillar, if you will, they actually start building it in space, and they build it downwards.
Well, when I first start talking to folks about it, I say, we build an elevator. We need a tower. Of course, almost everybody immediately thinks, "Portion, you're crazy." Do you know how? I mean, the highest towers we've built on Earth are, just about half a kilometer high now, over in the Middle East. And you're talking 23,000 miles? It'll take us 1,000 years to build it. No, we start from the top down. We actually use Earth's gravity to help build the tower. Now, you're going to have to launch the material up the geosynchronous orbit, which will be the single biggest cost of the project. But once you've achieved that, you have a permanent roadway. Imagine if, here's perhaps another analogy. The way we're getting into space right now is equivalent to like building a 747, putting 2 or 3 passengers on board, fly up from New York to L.A., and then junk the plane. Crash the plane. How about if you built a highway? You have a capital investment in building the highway from New York to L.A., which we've done, a great mega project, state highway system. But once you've got it built, 1 million people can travel on that road. That's the difference between first-generation space technology, meaning rockets. Second-generation technology will be elevators.
And what's fascinating about this, too, is that people would be able to travel into space, and we're just talking about going into space as a tourist, would be about the same price, as you say in your book, going from New York to Moscow, for instance. So it'd be very affordable for just about anybody.
Well, given the current crisis, I would not want to go to Moscow today.
Well, you were the one that used it in the book.
Well, politics were ever so slightly different then, but anywhere in the world. Let's say the flight from, which I've done, from the West Coast out to Seoul, Korea, about the same cost as compared to building a plane specifically for me to fly me from L.A. to Seoul and then push the plane into the ocean, which is what we do, as you know, with every rocket. 85% of that rocket is fuel, which you'll never get back. About 10% of the rocket is the hardware, of which most gets thrown away, and only about 5% of the rocket is actual real payload. That's why it's so expensive. And it always will be. We try a different way.
Now, what I really like about the exploration of this is the idea of reviving NASA, because people take a look at the fact, well, okay, we made it to the moon, so what? But it was the offshoots of projects like that that really created a lot of jobs and industries and spawned whole new ways of, doing things. Talk a little bit about that if you could.
Do we have 3 hours?
Well, the things that are relevant to most of our listeners, like the computer that's sitting on their lap.
Well, let me get very, very personal. And that is, my daughter had a serious medical emergency 2 years ago. She required 3 surgeries within 3 days. She had a rare birth defect that was triggering a blockage in a main vein leading into her heart. It was triggered by a birth defect. And I remember the second day of the surgery, we got through the first crisis. Second day, they were going to clean things out more, and then they were going to put a couple of stents in. The head surgeon invited me to sit in the computer control room. In fact, he wanted to talk about this very book, which I was working on at the time. And in our conversation, it segued a bit from, he was trying to chill me out a bit because I was anxious. My daughter was literally behind a glass wall with another surgeon working wires into her. And the surgeon I was sitting with was saying, do you see all the things that came out of NASA's technology that are in this room right now for your daughter? Monitoring systems, micro-technologies, computers. 30 years ago, the face of that same situation, my daughter's odds would have been significantly less, and they would have had to cut her open from her sternum clear down to her hip. Now it was a series of wires being worked in just from her calf, a 1/2-inch scar. She would have been in the hospital for months. That is but one of hundreds of examples. Too many people think, oh, NASA. Didn't we get Tang because of that?
Which wasn't that great of a drink to begin with.
No, I hated it. I was a kid when that was.
I remember as a kid, yeah, I wanted it too, then I tasted it like, why would I want something like this?
I can't even repeat what I said the first time I did it. But, okay, let's look at computers quickly. When Jack Kennedy made the challenge, let's go to the moon, May 1961, we finally settle on, so there's like 3 or 4 different ways of going there. And the system Apollo used was a single rocket launch to translunar trajectory, orbit the moon, then have a separate, smaller module, the LEM, descend to the moon's surface, and then only half of that would lift off, come back, link up with the command module, toss the LEM module aside, and then come back to Earth. That was the way to do it. Mm-hmm. Somebody pointed out, guys, there's a problem. The computer needed to guide the LEM to the surface. At the moment, will be bigger than the LEM that we're trying to design. And the weight is going to be astronomical. We as Americans in 1962 at this point said, okay, we're going to build it. By the time we put everything together starting in 1968, somebody's going to have to figure out how to make a computer about 50 pounds, about the size of the old proverbial bread box. Mm-hmm. It didn't exist in 1962. 1968 it did. By the way, that computer was 40K. Now, folks who might be listening to this program via their iPhone connections, the computer that put us on the moon had about, I think, 1/100,000th the computing capacity somebody is now holding in their hands today. Where did that come from? Mm-hmm. It came from NASA research. Mm-hmm. And then private industry stepped in and took it generations beyond. So NASA was the seedbed of a lot of that technological innovation that we take for granted today, from saving my daughter's life to being plugged into your cell phone to listen to your program.
You know, that brings up a really fascinating point about science and how it moves forward, and especially when you take a look, let's take a look at the bureaucracy, first of all, of a project like Pillar to the Sky, because you talk about that, and these are things people just don't think about. You know, most people walking around today, you know, you get an idea like the space pillar, you say they've got a nanotechnology, I believe it was carbon filler tubes or something like that, and you can certainly correct me on that. But they think, okay, there's the idea, let's go for it, you know. Now, you're going to plant this thing on the equator, and you really got to think about everything that's involved. And I'll give you an idea why. There's a friend of mine, and he's got a couple of beautiful art pieces. Somebody did an artist rendering of his idea, which is basically taking old airline fuselages, okay? They've kind of scrapped these to the side. They're not going to be in flight anymore. Mm-hmm. Taking these, recycling them, creating basically a bus out of them, but this would actually connect to where it's a sky car. Okay, so like for instance, I live in Portland, Oregon. That the idea is that you would build this rail car, the suspended car, much like you'd see at Disneyland, only the rail is above and not below the car. And so that's the first difference.
Yes, they're like the monorail. The old
exactly. Okay. And he estimates with this design that he's got going on here that it should reach, as he said on a newscast one time, anywhere from 1 to 200 miles an hour. Well, that's narrowing it down. That's pretty good, I guess. But anyway, the thing is you have to think about what it takes just for people to build a regular streetcar and all the red tape that gets involved with all the hands that are out, you know, for the money and the kickbacks. And you're proposing this is something that you want to build that would go across not only, you know, city lines, but county lines and state lines. You know, it's a wonder anything ever gets done.
There's a friend of mine who served in Congress and a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away was Speaker of the House of the United States. And when I was working on this book and we were talking about that very issue, bureaucracy, he would chuckle and say, you know, it took 20 years of bureaucratic red tape before they could put one more runway into the Atlanta airport.
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, I just flew in and out of yesterday. And I was looking at it's 20 years of red tape just to get off
20 years.
runway. Yeah, 20 years.
For a runway on an airport that already exists.
Now, let's look at one of the transforming mega projects in American history, the interstate highway system.
Mm-hmm.
That originally came out of, not many people know this, that came out of the Department of Defense. That was a DOD project initially as preparing for a thermonuclear war. The ability to quickly move emergency supplies, evacuate people, and everything else, inspired because our president was Eisenhower, who had fought against the Germans in World War II and how they used their Autobahn for operational and strategic movements. Now, back to the bureaucracy. America got behind the idea of the interstate highway system. This is about national defense and everything else. By the time they were finishing building it 20 years later, I remember one stretch of highway was only about 3 or 4 miles that still needed to be connected near where I live. It took 10 years of paperwork to get, and all the legal injunctions, and there was some rare 5-legged toad that lived there or something that were going to have to be evacuated. America, sadly, today is so tangled in all sorts of bureaucratic red tape that to build one of these things in American territory would be darn near impossible. So I'll have to drum roll. It's one of the few things I'll sort of pound the table and say, hey, I kind of thought of this one. There's an island nation in the Pacific that is very environmentally aware. The name of the nation is Kiribati. During World War II, it was known as the Gilbert Islands. It's an independent nation, about 120,000 people. And 7 years ago, they applied to New Zealand for refugee status in the event of global warming. If global warming is true, we're not going to debate whether that's true or not. I'm sort of a halfway believer, though it might be natural phenomena that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
If the oceans rise 6 feet, Kiribati disappears. It becomes uninhabitable. The entire island chain becomes uninhabitable. So I see some places like that which straddle the equator as being an ideal location that they would embrace the idea if we can build a pillar, there's an environmental impact positively that you and I haven't even talked about yet. That's what can you export from space back down to the Earth's surface. So unfortunately, when it comes to mega projects in most places, well, in America and a lot of other places in the world, until we change our system, they become impossible.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the book Pillar to the Sky, though, there seems to be a solution to that problem where you have this billionaire, he's also an engineer as well, that says, I'm going to go ahead and kick in all the funds. And it's interesting how, the thought of somebody with a lot of wealth that, they're going to come out of this thing ahead with even more money. And the fact is, he's saying, well, the bottom line is it's going to cost me pretty much everything I own, more or less, to get this thing started. Then we're going to need some fundraising and how you can try to fly under the radar just enough to get this project started before all that red tape and bureaucracy steps in a non-cooperative way into a more cooperative one.
My character, Franklin Smith, who you've just described, this billionaire, I modeled him after men who are, I feel, wrongly called the robber barons of the 19th century. Remember, Andrew Carnegie came to America penniless.
Right.
He built an empire that, in today's money, would well be into the hundreds of billions of dollars. What did he spend the last half of his life doing?
Giving it all back. Mm-hmm.
Andrew Carnegie, to paraphrase a quote from him, which was, he said, I spent half my life making it, I'm giving half my life to give it away, but he also said, he who dies wealthy dies poor. Now, there are people with that attitude today. I actually see the building of a pillar. It's going to be a cooperative effort eventually of private enterprise, and then eventually public opinion and support will go, we want to see this thing get all the way through, and then an entity like NASA with its incredible research teams are there to kick in on it as well. So I see it as both public and private venture will be the mega projects of the future.
You see, and that's the interesting approach to something like this, is that you get it started, you rally public support, then Congress really gets really tied up in the fact, okay, what do? We do want to continue, working in public office, so, all right, let's find a way to go along with this and look like the heroes.
Well, if folks, there's 2 reviews on my book which are really interesting, even though I got really angry at the one and I wrote back to them. But if folks look at my book, Pillar to the Sky, on Amazon, the reviewer, like 57th or 58th reviewer, just riddles. I mean, he just shreds me from one end to the other. But what really, I can handle being personally shredded. But then he started shredding NASA. And there's several things in the world you don't do in front of it. You don't kick a dog. You don't be mean to kids. And yes, I'm sexist enough that you open doors for women and everything else, and you're polite. Don't mess with NASA. Right?
I agree with you.
And the guy was, they've been boring us for 40 years, and they can't do it. And I wrote back, I said, wait a minute. NASA is a government entity. The executive branch makes proposals. Congress decides the funding. Now, if the executive and Congress had said, we're going to go to Mars, believe me, the employees at NASA would be jumping up and down and cheering in the streets. They are mandated to do certain things. Their budget works a certain way. They work within those parameters. And I see them as heroes. And I mean, I didn't want to get into a long-winded argument with that particular person, but I thought, what about when Mars Curiosity touched down? It's been almost 2 years now. That was a flashback moment to me of when we went to the moon. I mean, I was sitting there glued to the TV at 2 o'clock, and my daughter was with me. I was saying, Megan, it was like this when I was your age, and we went down on the moon. NASA can do remarkable things, but it needs public support, constituency, congressmen, and eventually a president who are saying, let's go. We could be back on the moon in 6 to 8 years if we had the will to do it.
And the other thing you touched on a little bit as you talked about your daughter and the spin-offs of NASA, which allowed ways of surgery to happen today that, as you said, 15, 20 years ago would have been unthinkable. And that is space travel. A lot of people think, well, okay, they think more of the tourist. I'm going out in space, there it is, okay, I can say I've done this. But you take a look, for instance, I remember the movie Contact starring Jodie Foster.
Oh, gosh, I cry. Okay, I cry at that one scene.
Yeah, where he is, in space, and this is the guy that's really seemingly orchestrating all of these, this whole thing here, and he's in space because it's the only thing that keeps the cancer from eating him alive, so there's this zero-gravity thought for people who have disabilities or these diseases, or whatever the case is, where it really changes the game medically speaking as well. And I know myself, I had a pretty devastating blow with my own son, and, and the fact is, for instance, around that time, George W. Bush was talking about how he was going to ban or, strike out against stem cell research. And for me as a parent, realizing the possibility of what a stem cell can do, which is to possibly regrow an organ that the body wouldn't reject because it comes from its own stem cell, I thought, is this guy an idiot? And I'm sure there were a lot of parents just like me thinking, who is this guy to dictate removing the possibilities of a possible cure for something, But now, of course, that isn't the case, and stem cells have moved forward, and there you go. But, here's that whole other level, when it comes to space exploration, and then, of course, NASA research as well.
You're throwing me an underhand pitch here, nice and slow so I can try and hit it, which I will, I hope.
Well, the space elevator does that.
Well, one of the factors in writing this was my father was a proud pre-World War II cavalry trooper. He fell, he shattered his pelvis at the age of 87. He never got out of bed again. And a year and a half later, I remember my doctor saying the clock is now ticking. If it hadn't been for that, your dad could have lived well into his 90s. And A year and a half later, he died. He never walked again. A year and a half of deterioration and humiliation. Imagine a world 25 years from now where, okay, my father's going to go to a retirement community. He's going to go to a retirement community that is set far enough out on the elevator that it's 1/8 Earth gravity. Dad could have walked again. It would have been like a brace on him or something. He could have had years of mobility. And let me toss to your entire audience, I heard an ad yesterday that put a chill down my back. You know, it's an ad for some sort of medical thing, and said, all of you of the baby boom generation who are now senior citizens. I was like, wait a minute. I'm still a baby boomer. I'm a baby boomer. We were going to stay young forever. But we have that whole baby boom generation now. We're slipping into senior citizen status. Mm-hmm. Well, guys, how about if we have mobility issues or our heart can no longer handle the stress of pumping our body in 1G environments, so many different things. States could very well be the retirement communities of the late 21st century if we get into elevator technology. And then there would be a real debate with the kids back on Earth. Where are we going to spend Christmas and Hanukkah? We're going to stay here. We're going to visit Grandma and Grandpa. And, of course, the great-grandkids are going to be saying, let's go. The potential spin-off with any mega technology, the unintended consequences are startling. It's been true of every mega technology America's ever embarked upon. Spin-offs coming off of that are startling and unforeseen, and so many of them are so incredibly positive.
You know, it's such a neat book to wrap your head around to realize that it feels like it's right at our fingertips. How long do you see before this does move forward, if in fact it does?
All right. If my fictional character of Franklin Smith, the billionaire, is real and he's listening to your program and he calls you back later and says, I want to sit down with Forstchen and some other guys and other scientists at NASA, the men and women there, without exaggeration, we could have it in 15 years.
Mm-hmm. 15 years. Wow. Yeah.
If that seems startling to us, remember Jack Kennedy, when he challenged us to go to the moon in 1961, our total flight time in space was less than 15 minutes. We did it in 8 years and 3 months. We were on the moon.
Yeah, that's just such an amazing thing for us to be able to grab a hold of, and just the possibilities. I know just in mainstream, you hear people talking about already the possibility of colonizing Mars. It isn't will we get to Mars, it's, how can we colonate it? So we're already thinking ahead naturally that way. And to see something like this that actually puts you even closer, it's just really amazing to think about something like that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Mars concept because, there's a private venture firm in Europe right now that's saying in 8 years they're going to send a team out there. We are still locked in the mindset of astronauts take off, land, plant the flag, gather some rocks and everything, and then they fly back. When it goes to Mars, let's think of what happened along the coast of North America in the 17th century. The ships were one-way trips. Mm-hmm. Plymouth, Jamestown, the settlements that started to develop along the coast of North America. Those people did not come over, gather a couple samples, and go back to England. They came to stay. And I believe going to Mars is going to be a trip to go and stay. And right now, if we took the capital investment to just go to Mars, put some astronauts there, and come back 6 months later, it would be about the same cost of building the pillar. Once you built the pillar, the cost to going to Mars would be about 1/50th to 1/100th of what it currently is right now. Because you haul all that material up on the elevator. Right now, the cost to get the geosync 23,000 miles out is about upwards of $10,000 to $15,000 a pound. Kilogram. That drops to $10 to $50 a pound with a space elevator. So all your cost of hauling up fuel for the rest of the journey, equipment, food, supplies, all of it, including your personnel, go up the elevator, assemble it up there, then go to Mars, actually the cost will be about the same as just simply trying to lift off straight from the surface of Earth and going to Mars, in fact. That's why I'm so excited about the idea, is our ability to go to the moon, Mars, and beyond. The cost is a fraction of what it is right now.
Mm-hmm. You know, and when you think about the fact that fossil fuels are on their way out for the most part, or at least, you know, any of the somewhat clean-burning ones like oil, have to move back to coal, that makes it even worse, is that, you know, we're going to have to do something anyway, so. And it seems that that's being slowed down perhaps by people who profit from these particular ways of burning fuel.
Yep, and you've hit the other thing. The second reason I'm so enthralled with the filler is it's not about what goes up, it's also about what comes down. I'm fascinated. I endorse solar technology, solar panel, solar energy. But how many hours a day does that system run? You rig the solar panels out in space. You hotwire them. You actually have now a high conductivity cables made out of various carbon nanotubes or graphene. You could be hotwiring the solar panels in space, generating gigawatts of energy 24/7, 365, not 8 hours for so many days out of the year if you got sunny weather. Then you just pipe that energy back down to the Earth's surface and from there distribute it on to the rest of the world. We could be generating almost all of our electricity from space in 25 to 30 years, therefore shutting down the Fukushimas, therefore shutting down our CO2 and sulfur dioxide emissions and everything else. You've got clean, green energy coming from space.
Mm-hmm. You know, interestingly enough, it was I believe, a popular science book I was thumbing through one day, and the Japanese were working on a prototype, I guess, maybe in concept, of creating a solar band around planet Earth. I thought, okay, well, that's nice, but, you know, the fact is you're still dealing with a singularity person who's in control of making sure that you have energy. But I thought that was a pretty wild thought. You know, here you go, a solar band around planet Earth.
But also, at any given moment, at optimum conditions, only 25 to 30% of the panels you have out would actually be generating energy, which has already been reduced somewhat through the transfer of the photons, you know, through the Earth's atmosphere down to the solar panels, put them out in the vacuum of space where they could be generating 24/7, 365.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, that's what they would be doing. This band would be outside around planet Earth.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
I'm sorry.
cool.
I kind of thought you might have misunderstood. No, not on the planet, but actually out in space around Earth.
Okay, I like that.
But I looked at that and I thought, boy, that's a phenomenon. That's a mega project if I've ever heard of one. So.
Yeah, but they're going to have to be moving 10 at least. I'm just grabbing the number out of the hat. I know the number's wrong, but we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of tons of panels if we're using rockets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, if I had a calculator in front of me, you know how much CO2 emissions and everything else I'd be dumping into the atmosphere to get them up there?
Mm-hmm.
Where if you build the elevator, hey, just ride them up the elevator and deploy them from there. And then you have like a wagon spoke effect, finally. I'd like to imagine 75 years from now, if you were 1,000 miles above one of the poles, North or South Pole, and you're looking down, straight down, Earth will look like a wagon wheel. In other words, the spokes would be a couple of dozen elevators deployed out of the Earth's equator and then supporting the Japanese concept of the solar ring around the sun. In fact, I forget which science fiction writers speculated on ring worlds back in the I think it was David Niven back in the 1970s.
Well, you also mentioned, too, that it's the Japanese in your book that are actually developing this filament, this material that they're going to build this pillar from.
Well, the Japanese but we're going to have to go back to 1979. Arthur C. Clarke wrote the book that sort of broke the idea of killer technology to the general public. It's called Fountains of Paradise. Clarke, when he wrote the book, speculated that it would take 200 years for the technology to catch up to reach his dream. Japanese were at the forefront of some of this research for carbon nanotubing, C60, or buckyballs, as some people call it. We don't quite know where it is now, but the technology, gosh, somebody sent me the article a week ago. I saw it. I forget which university research team now spinning it out at meter length right here in the United States, which means if you can make it a meter, you can make it 100,000 meters. So that is a humongous breakthrough. To go from, in a way, we misspeak when we call it nanotubing, because this technology 10, 15 years ago, they were barely able to string one out to a couple of millimeters. Well, we're now up to meter length. And then just with the last couple of weeks, people have been sending me articles on graphene, a slightly different approach that is going to revolutionize electrical distribution, all sorts of things, construction material. Mm-hmm. I should throw in that I started working on this project 2.5 years ago, and it's been amazing to me how technology has been leaping around, through, and ahead of what I've been writing about. Mm-hmm. Like one reviewer took me to task fairly. He said, wait a minute, it can now be done this, and this way. And I've been wanting to reach back to this guy and say, you're right. Some of the stuff I describe in my book is already becoming outdated. There's different ways of doing things. It's fascinating how rapidly this is moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's all very exciting. What is it? How are you going to? Are you going to be involved in these projects, kind of keeping tabs on it as they begin to happen, or what's going on there?
Absolutely, yes.
So we expect a couple more books, but more nonfiction, to say this is what's happening, folks.
Well, it just so happens my contractual obligation for turning in the sequel is coming up rather quickly. My editor's like nudging me, okay, Bill, when are we going to get the sequel for this one? But that's the excitement for me. Imagine a science fiction writer of the late 1980s, early 1990s, conceptualizing where the internet was going to be in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And then the technology is racing right alongside of him. Now, in the mid-90s, there was finally the huge breakthrough in internet technology and the means of routing, the www, which we don't even pay attention to anymore when we're doing searches for material. Mm-hmm. Some of us are old enough to remember how you had to put in www / whatever, and then a string command. We don't even do that anymore. Mm-hmm. That's only been around for 20 years, less than 20 years.
Yeah, here's an even simpler one. You remember when we never used to have to dial the area code before our phone number? Oh, that's all we need is 3 more numbers, and it was such a pain in the butt. Now you can't even rattle your phone number off without saying the area code first.
Well, wait a minute. We don't even remember our phone numbers anymore. If I drop this phone and it broke,
you'll have no more friends.
to get a hold of my girlfriend, I had to drive to her house and say, my phone's broke. How do I reach you?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Let me throw this in. How many people remember this sound? Okay, I'm going to try and do it for your audience. Do you remember that sound?
Sort of.
That's when you used to have a modem operating
at
1200 baud, and you had to turn the modem on and activate it, and it would do that da-da-da, and then like a hissing sound, and then boop, and that meant you were finally online. Mm-hmm.
Well, what's even funnier for the listeners out there is you really want to go back in the Wayback Machine, and we're only talking, let's see, what was that? I think it was around 1980 or 81 when it came out. So what is that, about 30 years later?
I love Wayback Machine.
Go back and watch the movie War Games starring Matthew Broderick.
Oh, yes.
Talk about clunky machines.
In fact, he's using a modem that makes that noise.
Exactly.
Okay, we're online. We're getting in now.
What I liked was the scene, especially when he's out there at the phone booth trying to find something, because he doesn't have any money, and happens to pick up this beer can tab, and he can call anywhere he wants to. And I'm like, I didn't realize it was that simple.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and I remember one movie where the kid has like a little thing that will mimic the actual sound of the coins clinking into the machine. So I think maybe it's in that movie.
Could be, yeah.
But see, the internet is a mega technology. It was created from a million different sources, because those of us old enough to remember films in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In fact, if you can pull up film of the 1964 World's Fair with the World of Tomorrow, and then they're showing computers of the year 2000, it was those folks at AT&T and Bell had a huge building with a bunch of nerds in white coats, lab coats, running the computer.
Mm-hmm.
And you could dial your phone and get into the computer, and there was this Orwellian nightmare image of what computers were going to be like. Nobody conceptualized it was going to be a billion computers that we now hold in our hands, literally in our hands. I think we've all seen where the sale of desktops and ubiquitous laptops have just gone off the cliff. They can barely give them away now. And I dropped my iPad last night and cracked it, and I almost had a nervous breakdown right in front of my entire class.
Not to mention all the industries that have been put to sleep permanently as a result of the iPhone, and that is people such as Kodak. You remember when you used to have to turn in your pictures and wait a week before they were developed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Polaroid, Xerox, all sorts of, heck, everybody has essentially a xerography machine right on their desk.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all changed. When was the last time we even took photographs and had them developed and then framed them? That hit me yesterday. I was talking with a friend, and he asked me about how my daughter was doing and about the wonderful woman that I'm dating now. And I didn't have my iPad with me. And I opened my wallet, and I said, well, gosh, that photo of my daughter is like 5 years old. We don't, on a day-by-day basis, we don't connect with how incredible technologies keep slipping us into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And what we took for granted is like slipping into the past, and what we imagine as being impossible is now here.
Mm-hmm. Even more fascinating, too, is how technology has actually been rapidly changing our language and what we say. Now we're in the age of what is known as the selfie. So it seems like we're revisiting the 1980s all over again, but saying selfie instead.
You raise a fascinating point. If we could take the conversation that you and I have had, just in the last half hour or so, and we could send it back through time, 1970. Many of the things we're talking about, people would not even begin to understand what it is that we're referring to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll give you an idea just on that. Back in the 1970s, my cousin, his father was in a car crash, and this was, I believe, in the late 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
He died, and they brought him back to life. Back then, if you had said that, nobody would believe you. That was one of them rare things because it wasn't happening that often. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it's almost expected that if you die, they can bring you back to life.
Right.
It's different between not believing and having an expectation that it will happen. And that, to me, seems just as fascinating as the evolution of technology. Again, that along with the language, it's just quite incredible.
So many aspects about our lives. What parent today would buy a car and not expect a crumple-type unit in the car that would absorb most of the energy of impact, airbags, the things that used to kill. Look at the death rate from auto accidents of 40 years ago when the population was about 2/3 what it is now versus today.
Mm-hmm.
So much of that is because of technological innovations that we don't even pay attention to. I recall a media hoopla on the day that two cars that had airbags in them collided. It was the first time it happened. Two cars with airbags collided. Both people walked away from the accident. Both people would have died. Well, they limped away, but they were still alive.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even pay attention to the fact that these technologies are around us.
Yeah.
As we're talking about this, let's project ahead. We're talking about, my father being able to perhaps go into space. 30, 40 years from now, folks, you mean there was a time when we really just couldn't just get on an elevator-type system, and 2 days later, we're at geosynchronous orbit? You've got to be kidding me. How do people live before that?
Mm-hmm.
Limitless energy. There was a time when you guys were pumping how much crap into your atmosphere so you could turn on a light bulb?
Or even better still, for all of those Star Trek fans out there, there was the fourth Star Trek where they go back and get the whales to come back and tell this alien, hey, you're wrecking the planet. But there was that scene where they're in the hospital because they're trying to save Chekhov, and there's this lady laying there, and Bones, Dr. McCoy says, what's wrong with you? And she says, diabetes. He goes, oh, really? What are they going to do? And he says, she says, I'm going in for surgery. And he goes, here, take this. God, I can't believe it. We're back in the Stone Ages here.
Yeah. Remember, this is medieval. Or with Scotty. Remember the scene where Scotty leans towards the computer and goes, computer, do the following. And everybody's like staring at him. Right.
You got to learn technology in the right ways. There's no doubt about it.
I might be mistaken, but didn't he pick up the mouse and speak to it? Because the mouse had just come out about the time they made that movie.
Right, it did actually.
Yeah. I think he actually picked up the mouse and spoke to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So tell us, you said you've got another book in the works that's going to be a sequel to this one?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a sort of like duality to what I write. My previous book, 1 Second After, was about the threat of electromagnetic pulse weapons and what would happen if America was ever hit by one. Now, I'm working on the sequel to that right now. Once I wrap that up, I'm writing Pillar 2, which takes the story of Pillar technology forward by 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's what would happen. Novel 1 goes through the building of it. Novel 2 would be the impacts of it 10 years down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So the one book I'm working on, the sequel to 1 Second After, is highly depressing at times. But what I've loved about working on the Pillar book is it's invigorating.
Right, the possibility. Mm-hmm.
And also, it's so much fun to call somebody up. Now, let me emphasize something. People at NASA provided a lot of help. It was done on their time. So let me get a disclaimer in here. None of your tax dollars went into this, okay?
And if it did, so what? It's a better cause.
So, but there's been so many people who are just, this is their lives and their dreams.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been up to Goddard a number of times now. And when every person, we had a book signing there a couple months back, drove me crazy because there was 100 people that I was going to sign books for. I wanted to talk to each of them. Tell me what you do. Tell me what you're working on. Gosh, you mean you're doing this, this, and this? But there wasn't time to do that. I'll be going back to do a talk there in September, and I just love hanging out with them. In fact, one of the folks, it was 4 or 5 of us had lunch together, and it was kind of funny because the way he said, this guy said, you know what's funny? He says, we're geeking on you, and you're geeking on us.
Ah.
That was a great way of putting it.
Tell me, for our listeners out there, is there a website people can find out how to reach you and more about what's going on here?
I've got technological problems beyond my control.
That can happen from time to time.
In fact, as of today, I'm not on the internet, and I just had a screaming match with a representative of a large company that starts with the letter A, and I'm not going to fill in the other letters, but it ends with T. At the moment, the best way, there's several. One is my publisher, Tor/Forge, has a good site up on this stuff. Second, just run a search on space elevators, and you're going to be awed with how much information is out there.
Mm-hmm.
And then if folks want to get in touch with me directly, through my college address, just put a B in front of my last name, B. Forstchen at Montreat. That's MONTREAT.edu. Again, B. Forstchen at Montreat.edu.
Very good. And Pillar of the Sky, of course, as you were mentioning earlier, is definitely on Amazon.com.
And yeah, reading some of the reviews is amusing, but let me contrast the guy that ticked me off because he started trashing. He can yell at me, but don't trash NASA.
Right.
The next reviewer, and I have to kind of agree with him. He said, not a book for engineers or scientists. He said, he rather enjoyed the story, but he said, Forstchen wasn't quite up to where some of the technology is. The idea of tapering the pillar and such, and your total mass would be about 120 tons on the first thread. I was like, gosh, this guy really did his stuff. And, yeah, he's caught me on a couple points. Science fiction doesn't get it all right. I'm just hoping I can convey this can be a reality. And then guys like the guy who wrote in saying, you didn't quite get it all right, that it could have been this, this, and this, I want them to leap forward and say, we're going to make this happen. Do it for real.
Mm-hmm.
The same way H.G. Wells was writing 100 years ago about some scary stuff. I mean, he wrote a novel about nuclear weapons back around 1912.
Mm-hmm.
He was also writing books about how aviation was going to change the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, maybe he didn't get all the tech points right, but he got the broader concept correct. So I've emphasized it's a novel. There's some tech mistakes, or actually some technologies have changed since I even began to write it. But I pray that folks grasp this could be the great mega technology project of the 21st century. Well, let's go out as Americans and do it.
Mm-hmm. The book is Pillar to the Sky. Our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program, Dr. William Forstchen. And you gave out some of the contact information. We'll definitely have that on our website as well. It's been a real pleasure to have you here on the program talking about what's coming up ahead for us.
Thank you so much. This has been fun because you gave me the opportunity to get into some more of the technical details, which I really love to chat about. So thank you so much for getting the word out there.
You bet. Thank you again for joining us on the program. We'll look forward to your sequel. Definitely.
Great. Have a great day, sir.
You too, my friend. Thank you all for joining us as well. Remember, keep your dreams alive because they're possible. They only die when you decide you no longer want to pursue them. And Pillar to the Sky can be one of those books that can inspire you to the possibilities that may be beyond your grasp at this particular time, but they're still possibilities. Join us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. Another possibility is that you can subscribe for our e-news update. Yes, be exclusively involved in what we're putting out there. That way you'll stay a step ahead of your friends as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you again for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.